Oh, I know. It takes like 2 seconds to. That is true. They're still calling us every. Yep.
I think you must have heard me wrong. No, we didn't say that.
Yeah, they told me that they were going to be in there this morning. No, I think it was okay last night, but I think they paid for all of it today.
It's funny that he said it's really nice. They set up.
Abby. That's going to be weird. I think it's on the. Abby, can you hear me? Can't hear you yet. Okay.
Take your coat off and put it by our table.
Which means that we then are going to make a difference in the lives of others. That inward transformation is going to manifest itself in the way that we are going to touch the lives of other people. Wesley did not believe that one could be transformed inside and do nothing about it. That if I've been transformed, what naturally takes place is that I'm going to want to make a difference in the lives of other individuals. And you see the quote here from him. He says, such a society is no other than a company of men. At that time, they didn't use neutral language. Having a form and seeking the power of godliness, united in order to pray together, to receive the word of exhortation, and to watch over one another in love, that they may help each other to work out their salvation. So the working out of salvation was for Wesley this idea that we are concerned about our spiritual well-being, but also concerned about the well-being of others and what is taking place with them physically. So the key for all of this, in terms of those outside of the church for me, hinges on a couple of things. And the first is what I call, or I shouldn't say what others call asset mapping. And asset mapping is the way in which we learn about the resources that already exist in the community. One of the challenges congregations have is oftentimes we sort of predetermine what we think the community needs instead of actually figuring out what resources already exist in the community. A prime example. So if my church is in the community and we don't have a playground or area for children to play at the church, we may say, you know what would be great is if we build a play area for children, then the people in the community could come to the church and play in our playground. We haven't taken the time to go and figure out that there are already a couple of other places where children can go and play, and that it would make no sense for us to build an additional play area. Instead, we could support the work that's already taken place in those play areas. And you can run this through in many different ways. But asset mapping is actually going out and seeing what resources already exist in the community so that we're not simply predetermining what we think people want, but we actually know what is needed in the community. The second piece of that is a question. as we're doing this asset mapping, the question is, what do we need to learn? What is it that we need to learn about the individuals that are in the community? What are their desires? What are their hopes? What right now is thwarting those desires and hopes? So what do we need to learn so we can actually do the work that is necessary for us helping to actually make a difference in the community? Daniel's a pastor in the DC area, has a book called Walking with Nehemiah. He expresses this with the phrase talking about, as you do this work, what does your heart break for? You know, what is it that as you hear the stories of the people, what starts breaking your heart as a faith community? That you say, that's what we really want to do to make a difference in this community. And just a little bit about the Nehemiah stories. If you think about Nehemiah, you'll remember that he gets this report that the walls in Jerusalem are broken, that the gates have been basically burned with fire. And when he hears this report, of course, he weeps and mourns because this is his home place, even though he's in exile. And he's upset to hear this news of what has taken place to his home country. But what Nehemiah does is he does asset mapping. As you read and continue to read his story, the first thing he does when he's allowed to go home is he literally travels around the entire wall to see what has taken place and where it is broken. So he knows what he's up against in terms of what work needs to be done. And then he organizes the community around rebuilding the wall after he's done this work of asset mapping so that the people know what needs to take place. And he builds relationships with those individuals because many of them, of course, didn't know him since he had been in exile. So it's critical to build those relationships with the people in the community, and we'll talk more about that. But the key here is really focusing on knowing the resources in the community, taking the time to figure out what we need to learn before we actually go out and do the work. Let me pause there just to see if there's any initial questions. I'm hearing nothing, so I will keep going. I'm going to go through now some characteristics of early Methodist communities and how they sort of did this work of compassion. And I think it, of course, we can't copy what they did exactly, but I think it helps us to think more deeply about the work we need to do. The first thing that they did well was to connect. Connect with others in the communities, but also help others to connect to God. So that the focus that they did in these communities was to deepen their connection to God, and in deepening their connection to God, then broaden that to the community. And this connecting point, or the intersection of this connecting point, meant that they were always trying to help people to experience God's grace, while at the same time they were sharing and helping people with whatever their physical needs may be in the community. It is more challenging today, given the culture we live in, to make these connections. And this would be true even before the pandemic. If you look at most of the reports, Pew Foundation and others who do studies, the segment of the population that is increasing the fastest are those who claim no faith whatsoever, or no sort of religious affiliation whatsoever. So that where once we could assume, even if someone didn't come to church, that those individuals would still sort of claim Christianity. that is no longer the case in our culture. And those individuals are the fastest rising group of individuals in the culture. So we have more people now that are less interested in any religious affiliation than we have people who are interested in that affiliation. So connecting with individuals today is going to be more challenging than it ever has been previously. I think about Paul when I think about this challenge in Acts 17. And in Acts 17, of course, he has the challenge of talking to these individuals who really know nothing about God. And he sees this inscription, and he uses that to make a connection to the people, that he basically says, let me share with you what that inscription means, and then starts talking about God. We have to sort of be like Paul in a sense that we have to be able to make connections for people in the culture that can point them to our understanding of God, to help them to start that relationship. And that's going to be a lot of work, and it will not be easy work. What is going to be important in doing this is we have to be authentic, so that they know we're not putting on a false front, and they have to know we genuinely are interested in them. And it's not simply about trying to get more people to our church or to the congregation, that it's a genuine interest in them as individuals. So it's critical that we focus on connecting. Here, I give you a few questions. And these questions are important to think about. Why do you want to connect with people in your community? This question is critical because in many cases, people want to connect because, one, they want folk to help them to pay their bills in the church, which is not a good reason to connect. Secondly, they want to do things for people in the community, so that the church is a church that is doing well, but they want to connect so they can do things for people. The challenge with doing things for people is you're not doing things with them. They're not participating in the work that you're doing, so that basically you're treating them as a client and not as someone made in the image of God. So that the connection is not one of them becoming a brother or sister in Christ. The connection is one of them coming to receive some sort of goods from you. Now, this doesn't mean there aren't people who aren't going to need help, but again, you want to think about how are we doing things with them and not for them. An easy example is if you think about a soup kitchen. For a soup kitchen, people can come and receive food every Wednesday, and that's a wonderful thing, but then you're actually doing things for people. If you want to move it to doing things with people, you're now inviting them to not only come and receive soup, but to participate in serving others, so that it's a meal that you're sharing together. Participate possibly even in the preparation. So it's how you think about the work you're doing and including individuals in the work and not simply doing it for them. So why do you want to connect with people in your community? It's a critical question. And if the connection is simply about them helping you in some way or simply becoming clients, it's going to be hard to make those connections because people are going to see through that. The next question is, how are you currently connecting with people in your community? Are the ways you're currently connecting done in such a way that you are doing it because you see it as a benefit somehow to you, or are you doing it again because you want to do things for people? So how are you currently connecting? Are you connecting in a way that you're seeing this as something that is done with people? And then what should you reconsider to strengthen these connections? How is it that you can move towards a model where it's with people that can help strengthen the connections you're trying to do in the community. Ultimately, the hope is that we're going to touch lives so that they're going to build a relationship with Christ. And the key is, though, that we have to do it authentically in helping people to understand we are truly interested in who they are and are not simply treating them as sort of as objects. Next, open. One of the things that Wesley did that was really smart was that the societies were always open to everyone to come and participate. He had other small groups that were not open, that were sort of groups where it may be all men, all women, or mature people in the faith. But the societies were the place that were open and everyone was invited to participate. The question here is, what barriers do we set preventing others from entering or participating in our community? Why is it that others would not want to come and feel welcome or a part of the work that we are doing? Truly being open to where others feel like they can participate is a challenge that every faith community has, because we naturally tend to attract people who are like us, be it economically, be it ethnicity, or whatever you want to say. We tend to attract others who are like us, so that it's hard to really then be open to say all are welcome to experience the transforming work of God in this place. So the key is, how do we actually notice the barriers that we're setting, preventing people from participating in our community? And then not only noticing those barriers, but then saying we're going to set an expectation where we're going to get rid of those barriers so people can truly come participate. If you think about the woman at the well, Jesus at this time decides to take the long way when he walks, and encounters this woman at the well. And Jesus breaks down gender and ethnic barriers by having this conversation with her and engaging her. And he connects with her on her terms and listens for what she is seeking in terms of how she understands faith. In doing that, he then invites her to a different type of community, one that he says transcends the way they've thought about community in the past, and that is open for all. We are called to sort of do the same thing here, in that we're called to sort of break down these barriers and invite people to a different type of community, where we are brothers and sisters in Christ and are truly able to worship and move forward in a different way. I'm going to pause there again and give an opportunity for questions. And I can't see everyone, so if you have a question, just go ahead, please, and speak it out. All right. We'll go on. Mercy. Mercy is critically important in that all of our lives prayerfully are being shaped by the mercy of God. And we then are called to extend the same mercy to others. We become conduits of God's grace, would be a way to phrase it. That as God is transforming us through mercy, God then is also able to use us to be a conduit of God's grace for other individuals. So as we're experiencing God's love in our lives, it is transforming us so that we can then share this love with others. And this is particularly true in communities where people can see there is something different about us. I believe most of us have experienced those individuals in our congregations where you can just see there's something unique or different about them, that God's hand is really upon that individual. They have that sort of light that just compels and draws others towards them. This is sort of what is critical in terms of the way that mercy works and can transform us to do this work. One of the way that we could talk about this is called we become a means of grace. Means of grace simply means that as others encounter us, they experience God's grace. So that God is actually working through us. We become God's ambassadors, so that people can experience God's grace in their lives. As we think about the world we live in and the challenges people face, and how in many cases people are only experiencing often ill will, or something just as simple as folk cutting them off as they're driving down the street or something of that nature. To actually have someone to share God's grace with you can be a powerful experience. So that our role is to be those ambassadors where people are truly experiencing God's grace. This, of course, is challenging because, you know, if you get cut off while you're driving or something happens to you, it's easy to get upset and want to react where you may not be God's best ambassador at that moment. So that we are constantly having to remind ourselves of the role that God is asking us to play in terms of being God's ambassador, because it's easy to get caught up in the culture and the way that we treat other people in the world. The question is, when people look at our congregations, do they really see us being ambassadors of God's grace? If I were to go in your community, and if I did a survey of the community, would they recognize and know the difference you're making in the community? Would they see your congregation as being ambassadors of God's grace? Or would they look at me with a confused look if I started asking about the congregation? Are they familiar with any of the work that you're doing out in the community? If you're truly ambassadors of God's grace, then the people are going to know what is taking place. Even if they may not go to, First, they're going to know the works of First and what has taken place. So being ambassadors of God's grace is critically important. Next is mutuality. This again connects back to when we were talking about being open. And here is the welcoming. We're welcoming community despite our differences. And of course, the text, neither Jew nor Greek, slave or free, etc. So there's a place for us regardless of what our status is. The challenge, of course, we face is we have structural differences in our culture that often make it hard, even in our congregations, to welcome people who are different than we are. So we're working against those sort of structural differences and trying to make sure that there's mutuality. The key is understanding all of us have gifts to offer the community. All of us have differences, no matter how much we may be alike. And it's welcoming all of those differences and having people offer their gifts, and making space for those gifts is critically important. This is particularly true in congregations when it comes to age. Oftentimes, it's harder for younger people to share their gifts in the congregation because the congregation, the leadership can tend to be older, but the younger people also have wonderful gifts to offer that can make a difference in the congregation. So it's making space for people to offer those gifts. That's where the mutuality comes in. When we do this, it makes it possible for everyone to flourish. It's a recognition that we're all made in God's image. And flourishing is a term that is sort of different than just acceptance. If we go back to Wesley was against slavery during his time. And during his time, most people who were against slavery just wanted to end slavery. Wesley took it a step further and said it's more than just ending slavery, but what we really have to do is we have to make sure we're treating Africans as our sisters and brothers. It's that mutuality of making space for them. The question is, are we willing to treat others like they can be made in the image of Christ just like us? And if that's the case, then are we going to really make space for them and make space for their gifts in our community? It's one thing to want people to be a part of your community, to reach out to them. But then the question is, are you going to actually make space for them in the community itself? If you're not going to actually make space for them in the community, simply reaching out to them, you're going to lose them as quickly as they may come in the front door. They were going to go out the back door because they're not going to feel like it's a place they can call home. All right, I'll pause there again to see if there's any questions up to this point.
You mentioned that structural differences prevent, one of the challenges structural differences prevent there from being mutuality. Could you talk just a little bit about examples of structural differences?
Sure, absolutely. Let me give a couple of different examples. A great question, thank you. So just the way congregations sort of are structured with a top-down model, often of pastor, board of leaders. I don't know what you'd call it in the Nazarene church, but in the Methodist church, we'd call it sort of SPRC, the people who are sort of in the leadership positions, trustees. So these individuals would hold positions in the church where they would naturally be looked up as leaders. And if that group tends to be those individuals who are older, younger people can feel like there's not a place for them. And it's not that the church has done it purposely. It's just that these individuals, of course, probably have been there for a while, in service for a while. So they've naturally moved into leadership. But as from an outsider looking in, it could look like, well, there's no space for me in this congregation because only people of a certain age can be in leadership. If you're trying to reach a diverse community, if everybody in leadership is white, again, if and I'm not white, it may not look like there's a place for me. So these structural things that are in place that, again, may not be done to keep people out, but they can look like from an outsider that you have structures in place that would prevent them from participating.
Great, that's helpful, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Others?
I have a question.
Yes.
So you talked about like the structure in the church, but then, and I don't know if you're going to get to this later, how would you suggest getting everyone on board to get into this mindset? Because from what I see just in churches in general, there's already this like culture and structure in place. And I feel like a lot of these things are good, but it kind of starts with our own mindsets. How do you change that for every individual in the church already?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. It makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Let me say up front that you're not going to change it for every individual. As much as I would like to say it's going to be the case, you know, you rarely, I won't say never, but you rarely get 100% of people to agree. What you want to do is create a mindset change for enough people, which is going to change the culture of the church then to be different. And that is going to take place when people recognize the importance of, if we want younger people to really come and participate, then we have to make space for them to be in leadership also. So when you start appointing younger people in those positions, even though everyone may not agree, it's going to be enough of a shift where people are going to start seeing a difference and say, they're taking this seriously, and that's what's going to create the mindset change. So it's sort of getting enough people on board to start an action, actually following through, and then it's going to sort of move forward. Typically then what happens is, of course, if you were to come back 15 years later, that would be the new mindset. So usually the challenge we have is when you're trying to change a mindset, it's hard because people can't envision anything different because we've lived with the same vision for so long, that then when we switch it and we start living into it 15 years down the road, that has become the new vision in the way that we live things out. The challenge in the church is we typically get stuck and we don't like to change visions even as things around us may be changing. So the tricky piece is making sure, even as we are making those changes now, we just don't get stuck on one mindset, because we may have to shift again down the road. Great question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Others? All right, let's keep going. Unconventional. Here we have to really, I use a sort of a technical term, but exegete. But the key here is we have to really understand our context, which the work we talked about earlier in asset mapping will help us to do that. And the importance of understanding your context is, as you think about how you want to be creative and do things in your community, what may work in DC may not play in Indiana. They're two different contexts, so you can't do exactly the same things. Wesley was innovative in doing field preaching. And even there, others had done field preaching before Wesley. The reason it was different for Wesley is Wesley figured out you couldn't simply go out and preach in the field. You had to then invite the people to take a step after the field preaching where they were organized into a community or group. So the innovation really came in the organizing more so than the field preaching itself, although we often focus on the field preaching. But you know, the key is you have to understand the context and think about what makes sense in our context, which may be different than someplace else. Even in Indiana, if I'm in the suburb versus a rural area, what may make sense in the suburb may not make sense in the rural area. So we have to be very aware of the context of which we're working. Once we have really thought about our context, then the question becomes, how do we draw a different box? Not simply think outside of it, but draw a different box. How do we really then begin to think about doing something different that can help us to be creative in our context? And I like to think about these things as experiments. going back to what we were just talking about of the challenge of changing mindsets. So within congregations, whenever you talk about change, people tend to become very wary and don't want to move further. A better way to think about things is to think about it in terms of an experiment. And if we're doing an experiment, it means that the experiment has a period of time for which it will exist. And after that period of time, if we don't like the experiment, we can end it and go back to the way things were. People are more willing to do something if we talk about an experiment than if we're talking about we're going to make this change. An example just from my congregation in Kansas City. In my congregation in Kansas City, we wanted to start a different worship experience. And we realized that if we just went and said we wanted to start a different worship experience, that people were not going to be in favor of it for the most part. What we figured out, though, pretty quickly is if we presented it in terms of we're going to try an experiment during football season in Kansas City. People love their football. So that we will try a 8 a.m. worship experience so that those of you who want to go tailgate and watch the Chiefs, you can still come to worship at 8 a.m. and have plenty of time to go do these other things. This made perfect sense to them because it fit into sort of the way they wanted to live out their Sunday anyway. So they were willing to try this experiment. We said, we'll try it during football season. When football season is over, we'll come back and we can stop it. It went well. What we did not share with them was not going to be the same worship that we were doing at our traditional worship service. It was a completely different thing. But the people loved it. And when we came back and said, well, we told you, when football was over, we'd come back and end it. They didn't want to end it at that point in time because by that time they had sort of gotten into it and they enjoyed it. If we had just wanted to say we wanted to make a change, it never would have happened. But by presenting it as an experiment, it allowed people to think about it differently and we were able to move forward. So I think about things in terms of experiments because in that way, it does give you an opportunity to say, if it doesn't work, we'll end it, or we can change it if we think that there are other changes that need to be made. So that's critically important. Next is narrative. Narrative is, I'm using in the sense, two ways, really. The first is, as a congregation, we are to inhabit the narrative of the biblical message. And that narrative for Wesley was shaped by a deeper love of God and deeper love of neighbor. That's the narrative that we should be sort of pointing people towards in the way that we live our lives. And we should measure success, hopefully, in the way that we're growing in love towards God and our neighbor. So that's the narrative that should bind and tie us all together. But the second way that I'm using narrative is that our congregations embody a narrative. That if you go and ask people, what do you know about this church? People will say, that church is really friendly. They are willing to lend a helping hand and make a difference in the lives of other people. That church, is stuck up. They won't talk to you. They won't say anything to you. They won't even acknowledge that the rest of us are here. But there's a narrative that people have about your congregation. If people have a positive narrative about your congregation, it makes the work of connecting with others a lot easier because they already have a story where they're buying into you're doing something that's making a difference. Unfortunately, though, if they have a negative narrative about your congregation, it's going to make your work really hard because Now what you have to do is convince people that you're going to live an alternative narrative to that of which they are imagining. Typically, people create these narratives over time, and it may not even be the fault of the people who are currently at the church, but just be aware of the narrative people are saying about your congregation and how that impacts the work that you're trying to do and moving forward. In terms of loving of God, love of neighbor, talk about sort of acts of piety and acts of mercy and how to concretely do this. Acts of piety are those things that draw us closer to God: prayer, reading the scripture, communion, fasting. These are sort of the practices of the faith that draw us closer to God. Acts of mercy are those things that draw us closer to our neighbor, where we're physically seeing about them, where we're sharing and doing things with them if they're needing clothing, food, things of that nature. So it's the ways in which we're touching the lives of our neighbor. To create a different narrative, we really need to be grounded in acts of piety where we're committed to prayer, scripture, fasting, those things that draw us closer to God, while at the same time we're engaged in those acts of mercy that will connect us to our neighbor. Invitational. Invitation is critically important, and it gets at the heart of what you want to do. And here we're inviting people to experience transformation, God's transformation. It's more than simply coming to an event. We're inviting people to a different way of living their lives, and to a sort of a different story. It's not just inviting people to do good things or to do good ministry, because then we'd be a social agency. And this gets back to my point of, we really are seeking to make a spiritual difference in the lives of others. So we have a vision that is grounded in, we really are inviting people to a different way of doing things. Having said that, it's really important to make sure that we are intentional about extending invitations to other people to participate in the life of the church. In many cases, the reason that our congregations are not reaching other people is we're actually not inviting them to participate in anything. We need to be inviting them to participate in the ministries that are taking place, to be an active part of worship, to take place in the things that we're doing. And in this invitation, it's important that we keep a couple things in mind. One, if the person is not connected to the church in any way, in many cases, worship is not going to be the first thing they're going to come to. So it's probably going to make more sense to extend an invitation to a missional effort that is outside of the church, that's going to feel less scary than to coming to worship for the first time. So think about how you invite people to sort of a missional effort first. Second, that oftentimes when people come, one or two things happen. Nobody really talks to them, or we overwhelm them with everybody talking to them. So when we invite people and they come, we need to find that happy medium between overwhelming them with people all coming up and they get on sensory overload, to where they feel like nobody cares that they've actually showed up. So a happy medium between those two things. And finally, what I would say with invitation is, we often are afraid to invite people because they may say no, but we have to keep in mind that sometimes it's going to take more than one invitation, even if someone says no, before they're going to say yes. So we shouldn't be afraid to continually extend invitations to people, even if at the first time they don't immediately say yes. Let me pause there again for questions. All right, we've got a couple more.
I have a question.
Oh yeah, go for it. Yes.
With COVID-19, how can we invite people to come and share, knowing people are scared to get out and, and do things like that?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. And I should have said this when we were talking about the unconventional. COVID-19, of course, has created both a challenge and an opportunity for congregations. It means in many cases that we've had to think about invitations differently than we have in the past. I think now what we're extending invitations to people to often is some sort of online worship experience or ministry, at least where we're connecting with them, knowing that prayerfully in a few months, as people start getting vaccinated, we then will be able to invite them to in-person stuff. But the first point of contact with individuals right now will probably be some sort of online ministry or worship experience.
Is there anything else you want?
I heard two voices at once. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Whoever was that, go ahead. No. I know one way of connecting when we have do a funeral or something like that. I know I can reach people that we wouldn't normally reach out, and I've got one on Monday that just came up. So I try to be, involved in doing things like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Funerals are always a great place to reach out. And I will say also that even once things get back to somewhat normal, if you are doing sort of online worship and things, please continue to do so, because the truth is there are some people who may not want to physically come to the church in person, but they may continue to worship through your online presence. So that will be an opportunity to continue to connect with those people. We're calling it sort of a hybrid ministry that many congregations going forward are going to have sort of a hybrid ministry of in-person and online, where they're going to have to really be paying attention to two communities of folk. And you may have folk really from literally all around the world that may be connecting with you that you had not thought about doing before. So it's going to change the way we think about ministry to a certain extent.
Amen. Thank you, Doug.
Yeah.
I have a question there, Doctor.
Yeah.
Wanted to ask you, with more of a, do you see the future being more of an online outreach rather than physically being with each other, reaching out? If somebody reaches out online, is making that adjustment to reach back out in a personal way as well, online or through email or text or what have you? I guess, is there more of that happening or trending towards that direction?
I think that it's going to be a mixture once we get past this pandemic, that it's going to be a mixture of online and in person. I think we're at a point now where people are hungry actually to be with people and in person, so that when people are able to do that, they're going to be really excited to actually have human contact. But I also think there will be some individuals that will continue to want to participate but not do so in person, and those individuals will stay online. So that's where what you just talked about will still be important. So I think you're gonna have to do both of them once we get through this pandemic time.
Thank you very much.
You want me to go? Oh, you already got one?
Mhm.
Do you want me to go for you?
Want to?
Yeah, I will.
Is there another question? I hear someone talking. Yes, another question, or is this, no, okay. All right. Trustworthy. Can't say enough that given just what has happened, that has not been the fault of any of us, with what people see in the news and read about congregations and churches, that we really have to work hard to be a place that people can trust. Unfortunately, what people see in the news or read about churches is often the negative stuff and not the great things that we're doing to actually make a difference in the lives of others. So we have to work hard to be places that are trustworthy, to fight against those sort of trends that are taking place, where people know that these are places they can come, particularly if they have children, where they know the children are going to be safe. It's a safe environment, and that we're going to really genuinely care for their souls and their physical needs. So being a place that people can trust is critically important, particularly given the way that people often talk about the churches in the news. The other side of trustworthy is we also want to make sure it's a place where people feel valued. It's a community that's honest. It's a community that is not afraid of helping to transform people no matter where they may be in their sort of particular situation right now in life. And finally, our last one is yearning. The bottom line for all that we're trying to do is we're trying to help people to become like Christ. We're trying to help people to truly live their lives in a way to where daily they're taking a journey to become more like Christ. This is what we're inviting people to do. And this is what we're hopefully journeying with them towards as we think about why it's important to connect with others. When we get into survival mode, or when we're just holding on, we tend to move away from this journey to be like Christ. So we need to make sure we're not losing sight of this idea of being like Christ. We have to make sure that all that we're doing is shaped around this yearning for us to think deeply about what it means to truly help others to take this journey with us. All right, so that lays the basic ground. What I'd like now here, Dr. Joe, if you can help, I would like you all in small groups for about 20 minutes to think about how you can reshape your church or your faith community around these characteristics, and which one or two of these characteristics will be the most challenging for you as you think about reshaping the work you're doing to do this work. And then, how do you then sustain these characteristics? So basically, how can you reshape your community around these characteristics? And as you think about that, which one or two are the most challenging? And how do you keep sustaining these as you move forward? So it's not just a program, but it's really the way that you live out doing compassionate ministry. Dr. Joe, I don't see, are you still there?
I think they're just going to have to do it at
Yeah.
their home. So
Great.
if the people, or even if they want to share right now, I think they would find if they share. There's a ton of items, so they would share.
We had a hard time hearing you, Dr. Joe. Sorry.
think that unfortunately I didn't set it up beforehand, so we can't do the breakout session.
Oh, okay.
That's my fault. But I think that we can, some of you are at home with someone, you can talk to them, or just talk in the group, if that's okay. There's not a ton of us. That be okay?
Yeah, absolutely. So if for Dr. Joe saying that he doesn't think that he set it up to do the groups, but that you can sort of talk there at home, or some of you are in places where you might be able to share with others. So if you could take about maybe 15 minutes to think about these things, and then we'll come back together and have you share your thoughts on this. Will that work, Dr. Drew?
Yes, so would you repeat it one more time for all of us?
Yep, absolutely. So you're going to think about the characteristics I just shared, and you're going to think about which one or two are going to be most challenging for you. As you think about the work of compassionate ministry, and you're going to think about how you're going to make this more than a program, is the best way to phrase it. So it's not something you just do short term and say we accomplish it, but it becomes sort of the way that you actually think about living out ministry itself. So which one or two are the most challenging, and how do you think about this as more than a program? So that's what you're going to do, and take about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back together.
Breakout, Dr. Bell, I think something that would help us and something we've been talking about is, we have really, our church has grown in their efforts and their heart, their compassion for even just the local community. I think the biggest question that maybe all of us would have is, how do we bridge the gap from, like you said earlier in the beginning, people that are maybe consider them like clients and not consider them partners in life with us or equal creation. Does that make sense? Like, it hit me in the beginning when you said that we want to make sure that we're treating them as fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, fellow creation. Then how do we bridge the gap? Because when you said it as you sitting here, when they get into the church, sometimes we overwhelm them. Sometimes nobody goes to them. Sometimes it's in between. And unfortunately, I think that it depends on what people look for. I don't know if that just seems to be the case. And so, how do we bridge that gap? How do we create the boldness within us to just look at people equally, look at people with potential, look at people with a heart that desires Christ, and they don't even know they desire Christ. Like, how do we bridge that gap and almost just fold them into, let's think about baking, just folding those ingredients into the life of the church, and at some point not even realizing that they were the flour that we put in 2 days ago. And so I think that's maybe where we're at. So how do we fold them into what's happening and create a place that people want to be folded into?
Yeah. I tell you what, I will answer that question. I don't want to sort of dictate what people say, but I have a couple of thoughts for you, and I will answer that when we come back after people think about it. But yeah, it's a great question, and I do have a couple of thoughts that you all can at least think about experimenting with as you move forward. Any other questions before you take about 15 minutes? And we'll come back together. All right, take 15 minutes. So it's let's say about 11:30. We'll come back at 11:30, and we'll share at that point in time. I'll see you all in a few minutes. few minutes we have left and answer any last minute questions you may have. But in responding to your question, I think a couple of things, and it sounds, you all were already saying it, so I'm not saying anything that you all aren't already thinking about. But in terms of helping people feel like you're doing things with them, one of the things I see churches doing now, even during the pandemic, as we are in a time where you're actually going to have to give out more things to people just because there are so many people hurting. But churches are also inviting those people to actually volunteer. So that is, so it's not simply, we're going to give this to you, but we welcome you to volunteer and to participate in this work alongside of us, so that it feels then like they're a part of what is taking place and not simply receiving something. So that's something that can be done. Of course, you got to have the appropriate protocols in terms of making sure that, with COVID going on, but as long as you have those in place, that's certainly something that can happen. The other thing that I would say towards that I think is extremely helpful is that oftentimes we are afraid to sort of just ask people, what can I pray for you? What is it that, our church can pray for you as you're going? So again, really thinking about sort of not just the physical needs, but the spiritual needs. And it's not sort of, in an intrusion in terms of you have to tell me your whole life story, but just we really, we lift up prayers every Sunday for people. Is there anything we can lift up for you during this time? And then if you see them next week and say, hey, we prayed for you and everything of that nature, do you want us to keep praying, or what is going on? So that someone talked about transforming evangelism. That starts that relationship building. So that's the second thing I would lift up that I think is critically important, because people then start seeing that it's a deeper concern about them and not simply, if you're handing them goods, you really do have a concern for who they are as a brother and sister in Christ. All right, I would love to hear from some of you for what you said. Did that help, Doctor? Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
But I would love to hear from some of you. What do you all, from some of you, think will be the challenges you face as you move forward, particularly, not just thinking about now with the pandemic, but even as you come out of the pandemic and the work that you're trying to do?
Fear. I think that the church is going to have to realize that in this next year, and we've talked a lot about this, but people, even with the vaccine and with masks and with sanitation, and, when you're thinking about serving others, fear is a realistic, is it safe? Is it not safe? I think that that's going to be in everyone's mind for the next year. And so we're going to have to deal with fear, and we're going to have to communicate love and fear, grace and fear. We've talked about, this year is going to be a shame-free year. And so whether you do one thing or the other, we're not going to shame you. And as a church, we're not going to shame you. You've got to make a decision that you need to make for your family. And so I think we're going to have some logistical challenges that never before in society have we had. And so we've got to be graceful and merciful with each other, especially in the church, because I think the enemy is ready to say, let's put division because of vaccines. Let's put division because of masks. Let's put division because of, he's ready to put it into the church so that we don't have the opportunity to look out, because we'll be too busy arguing within. And so I think we have to be careful. I think we have to address fear. I think we have to address that people deserve grace and people deserve to make the decision that they want to make this coming year.
Yeah.
And we are not the judges.
Yeah.
People take care of that. And so I would just say us being careful with each other and then with the people that we serve is going to be important as we do the work of the Lord.
Yeah, it's good. Let
Well,
me, oh, go ahead.
Well, with the clothes closet, you know, COVID has been horrible for a lot of us, but I think COVID has been actually pretty good for the clothes closet in a sense. Abby my sister, has had some wonderful experiences with people in the clothes closet, because before the COVID, everyone would come in, they'd line up. Even with a meal, everybody was jockeying for positions, trying to get down there first, and the atmosphere of it sometimes was just so chaotic. You know, trying to manage people and keep people calm, and everybody will get their turn. And so with COVID starting to take people down there, you know, one group at a time by appointment only, we were able to get names, the face, you know, get to know a face with a name, get to know their children by name. They would open up more. There was more time. It was relaxed. And so Abby has had some really great interactions with people. And then, of course, we punted again and changed a little bit more. And now we're delivering. And so people are calling my phone to make the appointments. And so we're trying to say, well, you know, tell me about your family and your situation and what are your needs and what color is your child's favorite color for clothing? What's your style? And things like that. We had a lady this week say, well, anything but granny. I don't want granny clothes. So, you know, it's kind of a chuckle, you know, but you get to know people that way. So it's been really hard, but I think, you know, a day is coming when we will be able to open up and ask people to help more and from our community. So we're excited for it. And, you know, what we say is blessed are the flexible, for they shall not be bent out of shape. And that's what we have to be. We have to be flexible for God's glory.
Yeah. And I will say, I mean, it's interesting. Something to consider is even when you can't get back, I wonder if keeping the appointment model helps, because it is allowing you to actually get to know the people. So it's one of those things where we should just immediately go back to the way we used to do it. That actually might be something to consider.
I think too, one of the things that has been interesting, you know, before with the clothing closet and the essentials and things of that nature, we didn't get a lot of feedback, but I know Ashley keeps showing me, like, week after week, we have more and more people that we're serving in the clothing closet and the essentials. And the same with the essentials, you know, we'll go out and pass 7 out and it takes hours. I'll get to 4 or 5, or Tristina will get to 2 or 3 because the conversations that are happening on the porch, which are different than when we did it, you know, house to house. But on Facebook, we've had a tremendous amount of people. In fact, some people in our church will text me and say, who's this? And I'm like, well, they got clothes at the clothing closet this week. Now they watch the service this week. And so it is, we've actually got feedback from people that we're serving, because it's more of a one-on-one. You know, Abby, Amy, they're talking to people, Tristina, Ashley, they're communicating. Then all of a sudden, 2 weeks later, they're commenting on our feed. And so I think the church would be surprised right now at the people that are connecting to our services. And when COVID is all done, it's going to be a tremendous celebration in heaven when they all come back together, because it's not going to look like it did pre-COVID.
It's great. And let me start, and then we'll keep going. I'm sorry. Something that Pastor Joe was talking about that I think goes back to the question asked earlier about change the mindset. One thing, and you all have heard this before, but in congregations, 20% of the people do 100% of the work. So it doesn't matter what size your congregation is, but basically 20% of you are the ones who are going to carry the load for what is going to take place at first. Yeah, that's right. So,
did you know that? So get your muscles going there.
That's right. So just keep in mind that you know, as much as we would love to have 100% of the people doing things, the reality is 20% of you are the ones who are going to be carrying the bulk of what takes place. But others,
we're ever grateful for you.
other insights from people of what you discussed?
I think you mentioned asset mapping. And I think I would like to see that even just in our church before we start going to the spiritual gift pieces for others, but we're going to need to have some infrastructure in place to be able to plug people in. We're going to need to know what we already have, who can organize, because there's got to be some structure or something happening to be able to put those people into place. Because I do think it's important. And I think Abby has some examples, and Amy from the Clothes Closet. Even when we did our community garden, the neighbor next door that came, helped to water. And when you can get them involved and it's a part of them being serving, it goes to what Kyle said. Then we're not in a place of superiority where, it's a co-role. And that's what, that's what Christ needs us to do. But I don't know if, as far as making sure we are utilizing what we have in our church gift-wise too, before we're ready to even utilize the community. I think that's something we need to make sure we're ready for.
Thank you. That was good, helpful. Others?
Well, if everybody is good, hearts are clear, I just first want to say thank you so much for taking your Saturday morning, being here, mull over this, pray over it. There's lots of work to be done and lots of work that's already being done. And we're just going to ask God to just continue to rest in it, guide us, send us, and give us direction. And Dr. Powe, we're so thankful for your words. We're thankful for even the books that we've read together. And we're just thankful for you coming and being here with us today and sharing your insight and your heart. And so thank you so much. And we just pray that your ministry would continue to be fruitful and that people would continue to hear your words. So
thank you. Can I close us out in prayer?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, great. So let's bow our heads. Gracious God, we're so thankful for First and the work that they are doing. We're so thankful for the way they are touching the lives of so many in the community and making a difference. We ask, Lord, that you would continue to fill them with your spirit, that you would help them to just stay energized for the race ahead, knowing that they're going to be running on for a while. Lord, help them to know that they do not run in vain, but that you continue to be with them every step of the way. Continue to help them to be that lighthouse so that others will see you shining brightly and they will come because they know it is there that they can truly feel at home. We thank you, Lord, for all that you are doing. We especially thank you for their pastor who is the shepherd of this flock. We ask now that you continue to be with them and all others during these challenging times. We ask this in your son's name. Amen.
Again, thank you, Dr. Powe, and we appreciate you being with us.
Thank you. I enjoyed it, and we'll be praying for you and look forward to checking in and hearing how it's going.
All right, great. God bless you all, and we'll see you online or in person tomorrow.
Hey, it's been a blessing to go through this today, Dr. Rowe. We appreciate it. And Joe, I'm glad you're doing better. And just blessings to all of you. And we just love everybody, and we give you all praise, glory, and honor to our Father in heaven. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Everything was